All right, so we are going to go ahead and move on and start talking about the endocrine system. And for this particular video, I want to focus on the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So before we even get into the whole hypothalamus pituitary, let's talk about the endocrine system just a little bit. So the endocrine system is a system, and sorry if you're hearing banging, they are still doing the roof across the street. So the endocrine system is a system of like glands and tissues that are going to secrete this stuff called hormones. And hormones are just chemical messengers that are going to be released into the blood, and that are going to have some kind of effect on some kind of target tissues or cells or, whatever. So that being said, let's talk about the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So the hypothalamus is just a structure in the brain. It produces a lot of hormones, and it helps a number of glands function. And there are two hormones that we talk about, and this is oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and they're going to be stored in the posterior pituitary. And so that's why usually we talk about it, is because the hypothalamus makes it, but it's actually stored in the posterior pituitary. Now, the pituitary itself is a two-part gland. There is the anterior portion, and there is the posterior portion. The anterior portion is called the anterior pituitary, or more specifically, the adenohypophysis. And it produces 6 different hormones, and we're going to talk about those hormones in this lab. And then the posterior pituitary, the posterior portion, is called the posterior pituitary, or again, more specifically, the neurohypophysis. And what it does is it actually receives hormones from the hypothalamus, stores them, and then it releases them. So let's look at these pictures. My picture is a little bit in the way, sorry about that. But we have here, this is the anterior portion of the pituitary, or the adenohypophysis, and this is the posterior, or neurohypophysis. Up here we have the hypothalamus, and then we have this thing called the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract here. And this is just going to go down into the posterior pituitary. Now, if we look at a histology, like a slide, this is actually flipped, okay? So over here we have the anterior portion on this side and the posterior portion on this side. Over here, this is actually the posterior portion, and this is the anterior portion, of the adenohypophysis and the neurohypophysis. The adenohypophysis is going to be this darker portion here. So let's move on. The hypothalamus is in the brain, it's part of the brain. It's in a region of the brain called the midbrain, and it produces, again, a number of hormones, but 2 specific ones we talk about are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. And what these hormones are going to do is they're going to travel down that hypothalamic hypophyseal tract that I just showed you a moment ago, and then they're stored in the posterior pituitary until they're needed. The hypothalamus does produce a number of other hormones, but we're not going to talk about them in lab. You may end up going over it in lecture. And there are a number of other homeostatic functions, and that's something that we really talk more about in AMP1. So the anterior pituitary produces 6 hormones. And the 6 hormones can be spelled out in the mnemonic FLAT PIG, FLATPG, no I, but it's just easier to remember flat pig. So the first hormone we talk about, these are not in order for the mnemonic on this particular PowerPoint presentation, or it's actually a PDF, but you get the point. They're not in order. So the first one we talk about is growth hormone, or GH. And growth hormone does what it sounds like it does. It causes growth, right? It stimulates mitosis. Remember, mitosis is nuclear division. This is where cells are multiplying, and the overall growth of the organism. It does target most organs, and tissues, there are some disorders associated with either overproduction or underproduction of growth hormone. So if a child has an excess of growth hormone, this can cause gigantism, and this is just going to cause excessive growth in size, but it's proportional. So the person, it grows proportionally, they just grow larger. If there is an overproduction of growth hormone in an adult, it's called acromegaly, and it's going to cause an increase in mass in and enlarged extremities. So basically what ends up happening is the individual's hands and feet grow, their facial bones continue to grow. In the textbook, at one point, there was actually a picture of an individual, and it showed her as she aged in the progression of the disease and how it affected her face. Underproduction of growth hormone can cause pituitary dwarfism in children, which is going to lead to extremely small stature. And then this rarely begins in adulthood, but it can cause a decrease in energy. Now, the one thing I do want to point out is he being Dr. O'Connell, has been nice enough to put put words in, I can't speak. Basically, the orange words are in your study guide, your lab manual. So he's trying to kind of point out what's really important to note to where you can fill in your lab manual. The A in flat is for Adrenocorticotropic Hormone, or ACTH. This is going to stimulate the zona fasciculata of the adrenal cortex. We haven't talked about the adrenal cortex, so that might not make any sense right now. We will in the 4th video for the first week of class, and that'll be on the adrenal glands. So the adrenal cortex is just part of the adrenal gland, and the zona fasciculata is just a section of the adrenal cortex. But what adrenocorticotropic hormone does is it causes the release of glucocorticoids, especially cortisol. There are, again, disorders associated with the over and underproduction. Overproduction, can cause Cushing's syndrome. And if an individual has Cushing's syndrome, they can end up with dramatic weight gain, moon face, excessive sweating. Underproduction leads to Addison's disease. The person may experience fatigue, weight loss, hyperpigmentation of the skin. That just means that their skin gets darker, and type 1 diabetes. The L in flat stands for Luteinizing Hormone, or LH. This targets the ovaries in females and the testes in males. In females, what it does is it stimulates ovulation. Ovulation is a release of the oocyte from the ovary. We'll talk about this in like chapter 28, 27, one of those chapters anyway. And corpus luteum formation. In males, it'll stimulate testosterone production. The F in flat is for follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. This is going to again target the ovaries in females and the testes in males. In females, what it's going to do is it's going to stimulate follicle maturation. It's called follicle stimulating hormone, so that makes sense, right? And oogonia formation, and we'll talk about this, what that means again later in the semester, but in males, it stimulates spermatogenesis and spermatogonia formation. Spermatogenesis is a production of sperm. The P in pigs is for prolactin, and this is going to target mammary glands and stimulate milk production. And it's important that you remember which hormone stimulates milk production and which hormone stimulates milk ejection. So milk production is stimulated by prolactin. If you're having a hard time remembering that, prolactin starts with the P, production starts with the P, and so there you go. It also stimulates maternal behavior. If the levels are elevated, if the levels of Again, I cannot speak. I'm just going to read it. Elevated levels will decrease estrogen levels in females and testosterone levels in males. This is a more common or pronounced thing in females because they produce more than males do. The T in flat is for thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. And what this is going to do is this is going to stimulate the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone. Okay, so this is actually stimulating the thyroid itself to make thyroid hormone. There are two main forms of thyroid hormone. There's T3 and T4. Overproduction can cause hyperthyroidism. Underproduction can cause hypothyroidism. And we'll talk about some of the stuff that occurs with hypo and hyperthyroidism when we get to the thyroid video. All right, so that was the anterior pituitary. Now we move to the posterior pituitary. Now remember, this is not technically a gland because it is not producing the hormone. It is only storing and releasing the hormone. And once again, it's also known as the neurohypophysis. So we talk about two hormones. The first is oxytocin. This is going to target the uterus, causing uterine contractions during menstruation and labor. And this is the hormone that causes milk ejection. Okay, so prolactin, production, oxytocin, ejection. And then this is also the, it's also known as like the cuddling hormone. It increases bonding in individuals. So if you snuggle up with somebody or even your pet, it'll increase oxytocin levels. Then we have finally antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and I'm going to talk about this in great length a couple of different times. Especially when we get to the chapter on the urinary system. But what it does is it targets kidney tubules to increase salt, urea, and then water reabsorption. And this is going to it's going to basically lead to a production of concentrated urine. So a diuretic is something that's going to make you urinate, make you produce volumes of urine. So an antidiuretic hormone is something that's going to make you conserve water. So you're going to produce a less volume and more concentrated urine. This is also going to target the skin and salivary glands to reduce water loss. Underproduction can lead to diabetes insipidus, and symptoms of this are going to include being really, really thirsty, consuming a lot of fluid, and then urinating a lot. All right, so that's all I have for this particular video, and I will see you on the next video.